Welcome to Founders Unplugged, hosted by Greg McCallum. Long-form, honest conversations with founders and entrepreneurs from around the world. This is part 2 of this episode. Be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't already. Link in the description.
This episode is brought to you by Founder Catalyst. If you're raising funds and you need to get yourself SCIS and EIS advanced assurance and you need some help with that, then stick around to find out how you can get 5% off of Founder Catalyst's services. I'll just quickly introduce and then we'll get back into it. So welcome back to part 2, everyone. Thanks for waiting a couple of days for it. I appreciate it. I'm back here with Alex Neill of Consumer Voice. If you haven't checked out part 1, go and check out part 1. It gives some context to what we're talking about because we're just going to pick up where we left off. And as you could probably tell in the break, we were just getting back into it. So I was like, quick, we have to click record and get... So AI, I was originally going to ask about Web3 first, but you were just talking about it. So you were saying you were seeing some interesting cases there. So carry on. What were you saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, AI is definitely a hot sort of. I mean, it's a hot buzzword everywhere you go. Obviously, startup world, everybody's AI this, AI that. Can't do a pitch without it. And but even in the legal world, where probably not pioneers for these things, there's plenty of people looking at it, plenty of people trying to use it. Whether that's the things like. So in cases where the big competition cases that we've been talking about, there are processes where people get millions of documents from defendants that they have to originally, paralegals and others would go through them all painstakingly, tag them all up into different buckets and for someone else to kind of review. Now that is all being done by AI, so the more forward thinking firms are starting to use lots of different AI products and, the reports there are pretty good at the sort of first pass level.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of innovation in
doing.
legal tech with AI because you said it's a lot of human capital that goes into sort of some
and expensive human
monotonous...
capital.
Yeah, exactly.
For quite monotonous tasks. But I think there's some really good results for things like disclosure review. There have been a few cases where it's obviously gone slightly wrong / hideously wrong, where people have used AI to write kind of skeleton arguments, opening arguments, and it's referenced cases that don't exist. So I think, as ever with anything, AI can help do a base layer, but it's all got to be checked. The homework needs to be checked. You can't just submit it without actually having somebody who knows what they're talking about looking through that.
Absolutely. But interesting enough, the point about AI that I wanted to bring up to you wasn't so much on that side. It was actually the consumer side. Which is that, there's a lot of rumblings about potentially huge lawsuits that are going to be around the corner against all of the major AI companies because of how these AI models were built and trained, which is on publicly available data. So that's interesting for me. I suspect I'm hearing pretty damning and convincing reports that these things will happen. They've already started to happen, I think, in small pockets. Companies like YouTube under an enormous amount of scrutiny, Reddit, etc., for being complicit in providing user data and, in fact, access, for example, to like my videos and everyone on the platform's videos on YouTube to train like voice models, LLMs, and things like that. So these companies have purchased that data, and of course, the consumer, while it might be in the small print, or may have been added to the terms and services later, never intentionally created content on those platforms with that as an explicit agreement that they'd opted in for it. So that's a huge thing that I think is coming. Do you know much about that? Have you kind of kept up to speed with that?
I mean, I think it's very much in the sort of background, and I think, I think people are thinking about all of those sorts of things, and I think not just from an AI point of view, but I mean, I think the broad principle there is where somebody is profiting on the back of somebody else's, kind of words, work, whatever that might be. So there's a lot in obviously copyright in particular as well, where people's voices, names, ideas are kind of been chewed up and spat out elsewhere. And I think it is a hugely complicated area, but I think you're right. I think there will be cases that come through this, and I think it'll be interesting to see how they're constructed and which ones will be the kind of winning ones, because I think there are certain things that you kind of think, okay, what's the harm? But in others where actually, it's somebody's business, or it's somebody's livelihood, or it's information that really ought not to have been, people would have thought again about sharing. And also people sort of thought, oh, it's a bit like with some of the case, there's a case against Facebook at the moment where, people didn't think that they were sharing, accessing a free service in exchange for their data being sold multiple times for billions of pounds to advertisers. And that's a really groundbreaking case, and it will be really interesting to see how that one goes through the courts.
But there's a part of me that's like, well, what did you expect?
I think,
do you know what I mean? Like, just to play devil's advocate, like I'm like, come on, nothing is free in life, like.
Yeah, I think there's definite. Well, you can appear for Facebook on that one, but I think even they, there was a whole conversation early on about that case where it was kind of saying, but there's no kind of, it's all for free and there's no financial transaction. And I think even Facebook's lawyers said, well, no, data does have value, and actually we did make quite a lot of money out of that. I think it's more, as you say.
There's an old saying in tech, isn't there? If the tech product is free, then you're the product.
Yeah, exactly. I think, if you're in tech, you probably know that. But if you're not, I think people are catching up to that now. But I think if you think when Facebook first came in, nobody knew what they were doing. And I think this is a lot of a problem for technology problems, because whilst if you're in the know, and obviously somebody like yourself and probably a lot of this audience are in the know, especially about things like AI, and they kind of go, of course, that's how it works. Of course, all your, actually for the normal person, it's not, of course. They didn't have a clue what was going on behind the scenes. I think it's then, though, about saying, but what was the harm? So,
but
it's not just about somebody generating a profit. It's about, but what has that really impacted? And I think that will be the bit for, for people to sort of nut through on things like AI is, did you really inform people? Was it proper consent that you got? And what harm have you caused to who? Because it's not every single thing that it's kind of doing, because there's some great things, but then some other things where people go, oh my God, I would have never told it that if it then meant this.
Yeah. But what the side of this that I find very interesting, and we're seeing it again now, but we saw it again with the kind of the .com boom, I guess, and the advent of, the internet really, and seeing that explode, is that the law itself, like these companies have broadly operated within the law pretty much the entire time, but it is the law that is being, it is a very slow thing in order, to get implemented and to be updated. Yeah. And so, and of course, and most of these companies, broadly speaking, again, there are always outliers, but broadly speaking, when the law is updated and changed, they will adapt to it. And okay, you could argue that they're just doing the bare minimum, that they should have had the foresight to approach things in a bit more of an ethical way. But at the end of the day, the law is there to be followed. And so you can very easily, I think, play both sides of this argument. I know I do. I go back and forth on it all the time in my mind, especially when it comes to big data as that example, whether it's to be sold for marketing or now for training AI, which is they're not breaking the law. Like, and when Facebook was first created, for example, there was no monetization, first of all. So there's that. And then if you update the terms and conditions, they did that in a way that was within the law. They sent an email, they notified people. It's up to people to click that and read through it. Like, you see what I mean? If you really get down in the nitty gritty, I'm sure there are instances where they could have done things better or they didn't do things right. But I'm just saying, very broadly, a lot of these companies like that. And with AI especially, we're seeing that play out, where it's like, these laws just don't simply exist yet. A lot of them, it's the Wild West, and so now we're having to sort of make it up as we go. Especially when it comes to copyright. Copyright has always been an area which is extremely difficult to navigate, extraordinarily complex and nuanced. But then you have instances like there's a very famous tech reviewer on YouTube, I forgot his name, he did a review of an AI video generation platform, and he asked it to create a video of an AI tech reviewer. And the image that was created was a guy sat at a desk, and he's very, his setup is very sort of iconic, right? His desk has a very specific look, and there's always one like succulent plant in a white pot kind of on his thing. And this video did that. And so at that point, he's like, I feel like this is crossing a line, because of the idea of, a tech reviewer could have pulled from countless images, but because he's the number one, and that's the image associated with it, his image, his brand is being sort of plagiarized, is essentially for it. I mean, that's an interesting thing where I think that is a claim that would probably stand up pretty well.
You know what I mean? Exactly. If people also, I mean, the key thing there is, would a person think, would another person look at that and think that was him? Right. And that would be like one of the key tests there, wouldn't it? Of when anything is being imitated, you've seen that with the brands fighting over Colin the Caterpillar or whatever, when Aldi copied it and M&S had a big scrap over that. And, as they tend to do. And a lot of that is about whether people, would actually understand who that was, whether it was someone different, and if they think it, and if they're, misled into thinking it is that person, or they get, also if they're detracting from the other person. But I think you're right. It's keeping track of all of that, it all being, making those arguments. It's just hugely complicated. And I think that is a problem for regulation. And, particularly, regulators are, like courts, they're not full of, people who are at the cutting edge of technology. That is starting to change. So, historically, people who worked in regulators were economists or lawyers, or, some of them with a consumer background, but mainly that's the sort of person that worked there. Well, actually, now that the CMA have suddenly got all these powers so the CMA being the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the UK's main regulatory body that's about enforcing consumer and competition laws. So that's their job. And so previously, nobody was really regulating big tech. And, the Digital Markets Act's come in and basically handed it to them and said, you do it. So, and along with things like the Online Safety Act, where, they've actually started to bring in quite strong, some would argue not strong enough, and we'll see how that one all plays out. But there's a lot of rhetoric around the Online Safety Act, really kind of tackling, on abusive online content and all those sorts of things. And that's been left with Ofcom, the media regulator, to do. And, so there's been a real recognition, I think, across the regulatory sphere, that some of these new technologies and things associated with digital markets that you only really see in digital markets need to be factored into regulation. But you're always playing catch up. And, tech is just moves so quickly that
and plus you're always trying to toe the line between open markets, making it easy for people to spin up businesses and conduct business, and things like free speech and so on. So there's a whole other, there's a lot of balls in the air that need to be juggled, I suppose. It's interesting as well, because from my perspective as a founder too. So my startup is involved in AI, and specifically AI data, or at least it will be. That's kind of the big thing we're working towards. And one of the very first things I did very early on, when we realized what we had on our hands and what we wanted to build, was we brought on 2 legal advisors immediately. Because my philosophy on this was always, there isn't a lot of law on this, but we should be operating in a way that we feel like we will always be within the law whenever that law is updated. That was like a very important North Star that I mentioned to when I was doing interviews for like these legal advisors and so on. And then as soon as I sort of found the two that were like, that's brilliant, and they were really on board with it, I was like, okay, you should join us. And I laid out kind of what I was broadly thinking in how to do that, which was, to be very, very clear about anonymization of data, to be very open and transparent about whether or not that's being sold to third parties, but also to be very, I believe, quite forward thinking in how we can create mechanisms and a system where people actually get royalties for anything that we make. On that. And a lot, there were a few that I was speaking to, they're like, why would you need to do that? I mean, that's just bad business. And I was like, okay, you're not progressing into the next stage.
Hi, a friendly reminder to share this episode with your network, like and subscribe. And if you are feeling really supportive, please consider reviewing the show on the podcast platform of your choice. It all really helps support what we do. Thank you. Now back to the show.
It's like, that's a philosophy thing for me. That's an ethical thing for me. We don't have to do it. And, we could wait until we're forced to, which may be what's on the horizon. But it's like, but that isn't the right thing to do. And I'd much rather be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Setting a good example so that we hopefully in future, if there are legal things need to be changed, we can be brought in as an example of how it can be done right from the beginning, as opposed to, lauded and lynched for an example of how it's done wrong. I think so. It is possible, basically is what I'm saying. I think to, not necessarily only operate within the law because, you can, but actually to say we don't need to do this, but we believe it's the right thing to do and set a precedent for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, as you say, you use the two kind of key phrases there. There's the kind of, it's law and ethics, and it's kind of how do you blend the two, which is, it's saying, look, well, this is the minimum, which is the law, we've got to comply with this, but also actually that your North Star shouldn't be compliance. It should be, exactly. That's the baseline. It should be about, ethically, where do we want to be? What aligns with our brand and our values? And I always think as well, you could kind of make it complicated, but actually the key thing is, could you sit down and talk to a friend, a relative, and feel comfortable explaining what you do?
Yeah, we feel good about it. Yeah.
And that they would feel good about it, you would feel good about it, and you'd be happy to defend it. Or we always used to call it the Radio 4 test. Would you be happy to go on radio, set up in a kind of critical interview and defend your practices? And it was always a test when I was kind of knocking around as a sort of senior comms person, when big decisions were made in business, was to say, if you're happy to go on and defend this, and talk about it openly, cool. Let's, does it pass that test?
I'm just thinking about like the 20-year-old founders listening to this right now going, there's a Radio 4?
Yeah, that's true. God, that's showing my age there, isn't it? It really is.
Our age, because I knew what he was talking about.
Yeah.
But it goes past Radio 1. I thought it was Radio 1 and Radio 1 Extra. I didn't realise.
I was going to say, are they even listening to that? But so that's where I suppose it is.
And what's a radio? Yeah. They're just Googling the word radio.
It's that, is it something you're going to get hate for online? Or would you, obviously you're going to get that anyway, but also do you feel,
is it defensible?
You can and
it's the
not
whole
just
thing.
defensible, but
can you sleep at night? Basically, is what you're saying, and I think so. But I think as entrepreneurs, we want to leave the world in a better place than we found it. What's interesting is that we are with where we are with technology and everything now. We're forced to think of these things, I think, a lot more than, let's say, our entrepreneurial forefathers had to, because they were building the landscape to begin with. They didn't have to confront any of these issues because they never would have even imagined that they were there. If we're talking about the Zuckerbergs of the world, the Bezoses of the world, there was no way they could have predicted where we were. So you can kind of give them a pass for when they first started to not have thought about these things, because of it just wouldn't have even factored into your thinking until now. And now whether or not they're doing enough is kind of a whole different topic. But we have the great fortune of having had that, seen the good and the bad, and so we should be thinking in that sort of conscious capitalistic way of how can we build things that don't repeat the same mistakes, and more importantly, help the whole industry and help people. It's not just about us, it's actually about the whole industry. We've got a responsibility that if we're in this industry that we love, we should be doing what we can in order to preserve it and not to run counter to it. Which brings me very nicely onto the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which was Web3. Now, you said in the break, you professed you don't know an enormous amount about it, but I'm interested to hear your take, because again, this is something actually that's been going on a lot longer than the sort of recent AI things to do with data, plagiarism, copyright, and so on. This is to do with outright scamming, especially in the crypto space. So do you know much of like anything at all about sort of what goes on there with like meme coins and sort of the rug pulling and the sort of scamming side of things in crypto?
Well, a little bit, and I obviously know, I guess, kind of more from a point of view of, obviously the financial regulator has just taken over and been given powers to regulate crypto. So again, it shows it's been around for years and years and years, and literally, only recently is it something that they're now looking at. I think from a point of view of, and there's actually a big claim against a load of the crypto exchanges for Bitcoin. So, again, we'll see how that one gets on, because it's very, very new. But I think the issue
Bitcoin, that's interesting, because that's considered to be like the golden child and the most stable and all that. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So I think the problem you have with things that are new, it's not the problem, but I guess it's just that there's a lot there where people often don't really understand what they're getting into. And so I think one of the big problems for things like crypto, like you say, is it is rife for scams. There isn't really, there's no, so whilst, one of the great things about where there are laws, legislation, rules around it is protections for consumers. But where that doesn't exist is, whilst that's great, kind of for entrepreneurs, sort of growing businesses, being able to sort of unhindered go into these markets, when they go wrong, they go really wrong for consumers. So, and people, back to our kind of previous chat about, education, understanding of people, whilst people might not understand all of their consumer rights, there is a sort of general basis that people think there's some safety net around me. Someone should stop this. Someone will. If this wasn't like allowed or was really dangerous, it would have been stopped. And I think there's something within a lot of people who kind of then go, oh shit, I just assumed that like I wouldn't just lose all my money, or this thing just wouldn't disappear, or I think a lot of work,
the faith-based kind of argument to not pay attention to a potential problem, which is and it's almost that authority thing too, which is that, well, if there's this much money in it, if it's this big, then there has to be stringent regulation, right?
Someone will step in if something really bad's happening. And I think obviously that, I think that the regulation at the moment is quite light touch. And I think it's really been about just kind of putting stark warnings on things for people, saying this is not a kind of, regulated product, or this is not a, you shouldn't. And again, I think a lot of the use, as you were talking earlier about the influencers, they weren't young kids, but they were kind of, 20s to 30s. There's quite a few cases where, influencers have been promoting crypto on their Instagrams.
Are you familiar with a YouTuber called CoffeeZilla?
No.
Oh, I'd highly recommend watching some of his content, especially his older video series, where he's an online investigative journalist who specializes in crypto scams, and especially those tied with influencers and things like that. And he does these really intricate, well-researched sort of videos, full investigations essentially. And he follows the money, he follows the sort of digital trail. Super interesting, but also incredibly eye-opening as to a whole world that's happening, but beneath the surface, primarily that's affecting young people. And it's just the whole new scam market, basically. And it's huge. We're talking billions and billions and billions. And it's kind of terrifying, really, that this is all happening and we don't know about it. I would highly recommend, if you ever want to, sort of, I don't know, get both depressed, but also slightly riled up about something. But he has moved the needle with his work, which is great. It's actually helped like, with some cases and actually help prosecute them, especially out in the States, because predominantly it's all out in the States anyway. So that's great. So it just goes to show that this kind of, shining the spotlight on things does work. Are you familiar with, this is going to be really random, but it's just popped in my head. Are you familiar with a computer game called CSGO?
No.
Okay. So are you familiar with loot boxes?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So CSGO was one of the first games, I guess, to really implement this in a really big way. And there is, and I only learned about this recently, there is a almost epidemic proportion level issue with this game and their loot box sort of system, basically creating gambling addictions within children around the world. And it's mind-boggling. And again, they are just about staying within the law every single time. Like, there'll be an update. They update something on their platform to just keep it within law. And I watched this documentary on it the other day. It blew my mind, and it's still going. And it's been going for like 20 years. Yeah. It's insane.
There's so much. The people have tried, like the Gambling Commission and others have really tried to sort of see, what's in scope there. And I think it ultimately got knocked back when it was, went into government to sort of see if there has been some tightening of regulations, but they're not directly regulated within games. And it's, I personally think it's appalling. Like you say, my opinion, it is gambling. 100%. It is encouraging gambling.
And they know it is.
It is absolutely manipulative, and it makes them an absolute fortune, and that just can't be right. I mean, again, there's a kind of an old phrase that kicks around in the consumer world, which is like, if you want to look and find where the bad behavior is, where there are practices that shouldn't be going on, it's where there is just massive profit margins. PPI was one of those. It should have been flashing red for years and years. Something going on here. If people are making 100% plus or whatever, massive profit margins on a product, let's have a look into that. Like, why is that happening? That can't be right. People don't gravitate towards overpaying on something. A competitive market shouldn't be producing that. Games, you shouldn't be making money out of this sort of thing. And I think with children as well,
when the amount of money you're making is on this peripheral thing and the actual game itself is hardly making any, then it's like, wait a minute.
There's something wrong. We've got something wrong. Whenever you see those sorts of things, they're always hallmarks. It's a bit like if we were talking about crypto and scams. Scammers are very clever. they look for
but it's like
all
NFTs.
Scams.
You didn't even touch on that. I mean, that was a whole thing that thankfully has kind of died a death because of the proliferation of the scammy behavior.
But it's even like things like, so I don't know if you've seen this one, and it's not super technical, but QR codes in car parks. So now scammers stick ones over the top.
Yeah.
And have just been making...
I was speaking to my local council about that fairly recently, actually. I think it was, last year at some point, because we were talking about doing a campaign for something, and we were saying, we know we can put QR codes, and they were, no, we can't do that anymore. And he explained that to me, and I was blown away. It's like, people will always find a way.
They kind of go, how can I do that? What's the consumer behavior that is that I can then disrupt and exploit? And it's it's sort of weirdly, oddly fascinating, but also quite horrific. And
it is. I mean, there is a whole psychological element to manipulation and taking advantage of people that is very fascinating. And it's something that probably people should be a little bit more aware of, so that they can avoid being manipulated. But I mean, the fact is, we live in a time where the attempts of scamming someone, it's something like 10 times a day or something. There are scams. There is an attempt at some scam on people. I mean, I as I've sat here, I've probably got 5 emails that have some sort of, phishing scam, some hacking attempt or something, probably a text or 2 as well, saying that I've missed a delivery of a package that I never ordered. Like, these things, this is the world we live in, and it's kind of scary.
That's why no one ever answers the phone. I mean, it's like the thing now of, if anyone rings you, and and there's all these mechanisms that are being kind of created that are then problematic for people trying to actually genuinely reach out and share their products or their service or their information with someone, because actually people won't answer the phone to you. I mean, it's very difficult to speak. I mean, it's very unfashionable to speak to people, but it has to be done. But like, people don't, and quite rightly, it must be very frustrating if you're working, in a call center and you're actually trying to talk to customers, because if you're making outbound calls, you might as well forget it, because everyone just says, no thanks, I'll ring back, which is completely the right thing to do.
Because I used to work back in the day. My first kind of exposure, I suppose, to the tech startup world was working as an outbound inside sales executive, and it was difficult. But these were people that we would be calling, not colds. These were people that had downloaded the app and started to fill it out, and we would call to. Well, obviously, our job was to sell it to them. And one of the first things that when I was called into this business to sort of help scale it, one of the first things I explained to the group of reps that I was with was, we have to very explicitly make very, very clear from the beginning that we are just there to help them set up their profile and to help them get the most value out of it. And then once they had the free trial, we'll call them back and see if they wanted to buy it. That's it. No other tactics, no manipulation, no actually trying to sell them on the benefits of it. Really, what we're doing is show them how it works. Let the product speak for itself. So we can never be accused of trying to manipulate people or twist their arms. But that initial first few seconds, the skepticism you had was unreal. So, I've just downloaded an app. Why am I getting a phone call? It even got to a point where we would say that ourselves. We would get ahead of it. We say, we know it's weird. You've just downloaded an app and now you're getting a phone call. We get it. But this is why we do it. We care. We want you to make the most of it. So we had that skepticism, and you have to address it head on. You can't just bury your head in the sand,
Yeah, which, I think links to a lot of what we were talking about early on, really, is like that kind of change in marketing and sales approach. It just has to be a softer, much more kind of human conversation about genuine help rather than just a kind of old-fashioned buy this thing type approach, because
and you have to make sure your service or product actually has value. Raising investment is painful enough without getting bogged down in legal costs. That's why I'm using Founder Catalyst, today's sponsor for Peer, my startup's pre-seed raise. We've been lucky enough to have Sam, the CEO of Founder Catalyst, on the show before. Go and check out that episode. Their funding round service offers the most cost-effective way to produce funding round legals in the UK. It's just £1,495 excluding VAT, with no monthly fees or hidden extras, no matter how much you're raising. One Founder Catalyst customer recently raised 2.7 million and saved around £10,000 compared to the next option. If you're looking for SEIS, EIS Advanced Assurance, they've got a 100% success rate over the last 3 years. Founder Catalyst is built by founders for founders, and from my own experience, I can't recommend them enough. You can scan the QR code on the screen around here somewhere or around there somewhere, I don't know, or use the link in the description for 5% off. Thank you to Founder Catalyst for sponsoring this episode. Now back to it. I mean, first and foremost, right? Which let's be honest, these days, because there's so many products and services on the market, many don't, because they are just, focused on the wrong things. But it also, this subject also makes me incredibly concerned from a mental health perspective, of especially young people, young adults, because talking about the atmosphere in which we live in, where you are trying to be scammed every second of your life, it's got to do something to you psychologically in terms of the way that you perceive the world around you and your relationship with trust, right? From that perspective, it's got to be odd. I mean, to live in, I defend young people all the time, as if I'm making myself sound way older than I am. But I'm in staunch defense of younger generations, and always have been, because increasingly the world we're giving them is more and more complex. And so when you look at their behavior, I think it's explainable within that context. It's that, you've got kids now that are thrown into the access to the entire world. They can speak to literally anyone. Their class situation of school, good and bad, is brought into their bedroom, and vice versa. They're exposed to all kinds of crazy shit online, and then on top of that, they've got a ton of, people either trying to get into their pants, right? As a kid, that's terrifying, right? Or trying to get into their wallets or their mum and dad's wallets. And psychologically, mental health wise, I mean, and then you factor in environment and bad food and diets and lack of, lack of exercise or whatever else. I mean, but that in of itself is quite a dystopian sort of, that can create a very dystopian mindset when what is the incentives there to really trust strangers or to put your faith in the goodness of people? That's going to jade you.
And you see that a lot in the kind of tracking around, that's really shifted, I'd say, in the last 20 years around trust in institutions, in trusted figures. I think who was it? I think it was who talks about the death of the expert, where it's kind of like, look, there used to be this kind of reserved territory for, doctors, lawyers, politicians, etc., that, you kind of trusted what those people said. And all of that has just shifted on its head, with all the big scandals around big institutions as well, post office, people like that, where it's kind of like, I used to trust the big company, So I think there's been big shifts in how people trust and who people trust and why. And I think part of that is that, if we flip it on the kind of, there's all these sort of negatives, but there are all these positives of this kind of world we live in today, which is, much more connected, much more open, much more opportunity, the ability for, I think of myself, I'm 43, I'm a founder for the first time, and I didn't sort of enter this world from a background of entrepreneurs or whatever, and but I've been able to kind of find my way into it and do it, not through being able to sort of a background of knowing people with deep pockets, etc. So I think there's much more opportunity now for people. It's not perfect, but it's definitely better than it was, and people really being able to sort of think about doing anything. Again, I sort of go back and think of my upbringing, and it was very much more about, you work for the big company and you should stay there, rather than that's just totally different now, where people see themselves driving their own career and making their own career, and they don't think, where could I go and do that? They think, how could I do that for myself, which is great. But I think people then don't think about, look, what are the downsides to that, and then how do you manage all of those risks? I've got a 3-year-old, so I'm sort of trying to kind of, you know, like how do I want him to be in this new world where we think of all these brilliant opportunities that he's got that I probably didn't have, but all these other massive risks. So it's kind of, how do you not scare the living daylights out of him, but also still allow him to like thrive in the world that we do have? So I think for lots of people, it's also, I feel like we're in a particular generation where, you know, we can see both. We can sort of remember the past, a little bit of like how it was, and we can also sort of understand enough to help them navigate, you know, through it, where we're not fully kind of immersed, but we sort of, whereas, you know, you go up a generation to my parents and they're like, oh my God, what is it that's sort of going on in the world right now?
They almost have too much nostalgia. It makes them pessimists, whereas I think we're in the right place where we still have enough excitement that we're actually fairly optimistic about these things. But then I think we run the risk of raising a generation of pessimists again, because of to your point, I don't think we're really communicating the opportunity that they have and the excitement and the possibilities, and instead we're just terrifying a generation, you know, to your point about sort of not being able to trust institutions, about misinformation, you know, all of this stuff. And and in our attempt to educate them to navigate the world, all we're doing is terrifying them and making them angry about the situation that we put them in. And it's like, actually, you know, there's never been a better time to be alive in the world. You know, if just from a data perspective, this is the best time. Your life is better than it would have been if you're born, you know, 10, 20, 30, 100 years ago. But we're not giving them that impression. We're giving young people the impression that this is the worst time to be alive, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think we're setting them up to fail miserably by doing that. Like, it's awful. Yeah, it's not perfect. There's a lot of change to be made, but there's a lot of awesome stuff you can do now.
And also, exactly. I think that's also right. It's almost kind of checking in and out of the kind of big picture, because I mean, look, you know it yourself as an adult as well. Like, if you spend too much time listening to the radio or watching the news, or, you know, just too much of what is going on in the world, it can actually be too much. So I think there's enough there. You need to consume enough to feel like you know what's happening in the world, but you also need to then kind of check into the real world and the people who are actually, you know, in your actual space that you can see, feel, hear, and touch, and kind of be more rooted in, you know, the day-to-day, the ordinary, the kind of, you know, it's a bit of like how it was, where, you know, I mean, I always used to say, I'm sure you kind of never used to understand what was going on in different parts of the world in the way that we do now, which is great, but it also can be quite depressing. You know, it's good
there's
to
debate about that, though. Do we really understand what's going on, or are we just being fed?
Well, gosh, that's a whole other thing, isn't it?
It's a whole other thing. We need another show for that one.
But I think to that point of kind of being look, you know, it's a privilege to have all this information, but then you also need to have coping mechanisms to sort of think about, okay, but there are only so many things that you can affect or do in a day, like you say. And if you consume too much that makes you feel helpless, that, as you say, is quite a depressing place to be in. Yeah. And, you know, the pandemic was interesting, I guess, for that in that way, because it did sort of feel like it shrunk everything, didn't it? And I know there's been all sorts of studies as well about how that period of time, you know, people can't, because you didn't make many memories. It feels like it wasn't a full normal year, where you kind of go, that year's sort of gone from everyone's minds. But in lots of ways, I think people discovered lots of like really great things about their local area or about local shops, or, you know, kind of had a bit of a slowdown. But
there's a psychological element of that too, which is that in the process of stopping, you're forced to reflect, right?
Yeah.
And which is what people seem to be most terrified of. Actually, which is generally people are actually quite terrified of being forced to reflect, which is why we tend to always have something going on, you know, whether it's putting something on, you know, watching something on our phone or doing this, because there are so many things to consider in our lives that, you know, for most people that's a daunting prospect. But one thing that it did do collectively was actually force people to do that. And that's why we saw off the back of that, people actually making some really big life-changing decisions, either starting that business that they always wanted to start, or starting a family, or getting married, or, you know, whatever it might be. Some really big life-changing decisions were made in that time, because they actually took stock and thought, you know, what is what is important to me. Plus also we were bombarded with the horrific messages of people losing their lives, and that's going to do something to make you consider mortality and stuff like that too. Not to get too philosophical, but that is a good point that sort of came in. It was an interesting time for sure. But look, before because we are running out of time, and I do want to touch on something else before I let you go. We could very clearly. This is always a problem with this show. We could just keep going, but we can't. I need to let you go. But before I do, I'm curious to know a bit more about you, because we're almost 2 hours in, and I barely asked you anything about you. So my apologies. But I'm interested. You were just saying about kind of your relationship with entrepreneurialism and how that wasn't really anything that you sort of ever considered before. So I'm curious to know, like, now that you're in it, did it meet your sort of your expectations that you had? Did you have some sort of preconceived notions of what entrepreneurialism was and how, and so on? What surprised you? What sort of met those expectations and so on?
It's interesting. As you say, I guess very, very briefly, my sort of career was, I did a law degree, I did a practice law, I went to work for the big company, and did a graduate scheme and all of that for a number of years, and was, massive multinational company, very happy there. Then went to Which and kind of did more than a decade in consumer advocacy and running digital businesses, and then got a real flair for, I guess, really sort of understanding what made me tick. So I had always had a fascination with the law. I really enjoyed being in a big company to see how they operate, how they operate within the rules and, all of that sort of thing. And I was in sales and marketing then, so I really enjoyed, that side of it. But then going to Which and kind of putting together, having a real purpose on a day-to-day basis in a role, trying to achieve a kind of higher purpose, but also within that, getting to be able to run essentially small startup businesses, kind of, I really like changing things, whether that's about really big things like to do with the world and consumers, or whether that's just about running businesses and changing how they work and making them kind of fly. So I think it was from really my time at Which that I suddenly thought, I really like this mix of stuff, and I'd like to run my own thing. And again, for a while, I sort of went to a small kind of tech startup and did that for a few years. But I think it was from there, onwards that I was like, actually, I'd like to run a thing too. I'd like to run my own thing, and I need to, but I want that to be something that has purpose. And, so obviously, kind of almost fell into it with Consumer Voice, because it was like, here's a great idea, and now I must go and do that, as opposed to me sort of being like, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur. And so for a while, I was kind of like, oh, I'm not really that. I'm just running. I've got to do this thing, and I'm on a mission to do it. And it's funny because the reaction of some people that have known me sort of, it's probably, kind of one step removed, maybe they've been in regulators or I've worked with them around the scenes, and they were always like, oh, I always thought you'd do something like that. And I was like, one of them said that to me, and I was kind of like laughed and went, why? I didn't. I was like, oh, how interesting. And they were like, oh no, you were always very entrepreneurial. I was like, was I? So I think that word probably had like some connotations to me when I was younger, that it was like, oh, that's what other people do from different backgrounds who are kind of a bit sort of maverick, and that's not me. So I think for me the interesting thing is probably sort of unpicking what maybe that word just has too much baggage, and that there's a lot of people who sort of go, oh, that's definitely not the sort of thing I do, to saying, look, if you think there's something that needs doing in the world and you're the person to do it, there's different ways. I think some people just, they want to be entrepreneurs and they find ideas, and other people, it's a bit like people say everyone's got a book in them. Probably everybody's got a business in them, if you pick, but it is that careful management between, it's not just an idea that you think's great, it's got to meet all these other sort of criteria around someone else out there thinks it's good, someone would want to use it, someone would want to pay for it, someone would want to buy it,
of course,
all those things. So I think for me, it's probably, it's sort of not this magical thing that you kind of thought it was, that, oh, here's these sort of madcap people that are entrepreneurs. They don't fit a particular mold. You don't have to have been in your bedroom since you were 17 coming up with this idea. And I think me and my co-founder, which again, I think is, interesting, that I co-founded a business rather than sort of decided to found one myself. That was a deliberate choice. The person, Nikki, who I co-founded Consumer Voice with, we've worked together for 11 years before. So we were both at Which together. She ran the research and publishing division, and I ran the charity side. So we worked together really closely. We've got complementary but different skills. So, it works really well for us to run a business together. And I really enjoy that. I think, when the times are tough, we've got each other, and when the times are good, we've got each other. So, I think, but I think co-founding a business is also can be tricky if you don't have that like long lasting trust or relationship or things to draw down on when things are tough, that you need to be able to have those honest conversations. You need to be able to both bounce off each other, but also kind of at times sort of go through that creative process of this is, we need to stop and rethink or et cetera. So I really enjoyed that, and I always knew that although I've got quite strong opinions and have got kind of a strong sort of vision, I also really like to work with somebody else, in terms of being able to then really drive things forward and move things forward as well. So I think if you're thinking of co-founding, then that's another layer to sort of consider, as to the who is sort of really, really important.
Funny enough, on the last episode, I was asked by my guests what my opinion was on co-founders and stuff like that, and I was quite vocal about, I think, in my experience, having talked to so many founders on this show now, sometimes multiple time founders, exited founders, and all that kind of thing, and the unanimous sort of thing that always came out on that particular topic was, if you can find a co-founder, do, because doing it on your own is bloody difficult. And there were those that did it on their own, and then they said, I would never do that again. My next business will be with a co-founder. And I'm very thankful that I have a co-founder myself as well, not my business. And to be honest, one of the main reasons why it's useful for me is because it keeps me reined in. Because I can go off, and then it's like, 3 a.m. I've got this idea, and I'm like, John, we've got to jump on a call. I've got to tell you about this thing, and I'll tell him, and he's like, okay, this is cool, but like, maybe we'll do it later. All right.
I think that's like ruthless prioritization.
Yeah.
For like, you can keep each other honest, you can keep each other in check, and as long as you are behaving in that way, like you say, often a good chairperson can do that, but they're still one step removed. Like, they're not in the guts of it, they're not in the trenches. Depending.
If you are enjoying this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe with notifications turned on, and let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. This lets YouTube know we are doing something right. Back to the show.
On what that relationship is. So I agree. And I think you can, as long as you've got that right balance as well, where for me, you've got a unique set of skills each, but you've also got some common ground. So you can, there's a way of communicating. You understand each other's, skill sets, you respect it, but you also understand where they kind of cross over. And there's that moment where you can kind of create something better together. I mean, I think that, I love working with Nikki day to day. We make sure as a practice, we work remotely, so we make sure as a practice at least every 2 weeks we spend a whole day together, working on the business, in the business, but side by side, and we just get so much more energy out of doing that. We speak every day, every minute of every day. Our husbands are kind of like, can you two please, who they don't even need to ask who we're talking to. My son is 3 and knows Nikki's name and knows, and they all have a great relationship. So it is like an extended family, but it's intense, so that you do have to really have like 100% trust in each other's intentions and each other's skill sets, and at times it's kind of like, look, we'll do this together, or at times it's like, you go and I've got to go and do this. So it's a horrible phrase, it's a journey, it is, and all of that. And we were talking about this earlier in terms of it can vary day to day, week to week, and there's just, you really have to be, I think one of the things that I've found about being an entrepreneur, I'm sort of struggling to say it, being an entrepreneur versus
be a proud entrepreneur, come on.
Versus running other people's businesses for them, is there's a level of satisfaction that you just sort of can't achieve. And I think once you've done it, I think it'd be very different and hard to sort of go back. I think
the highs are definitely far higher, but On the flip side, the lows are definitely way lower. That's
the responsibility that you feel for every single thing that you do is another level that you can't really.
It's all heightened.
And I remember an old boss of that saying that to me when I was sort of going into my first chief exec role, that he kind of said, look, Alex, you've run big businesses with lots of people, hundreds of people, and like big P&Ls and stuff, but running your own thing is a feeling, it can be very lonely. It's a lonely feeling, and it's just with you. And although you've got a team and although you consult people, it's a feeling that you just can't have until you're in it. And at the time I was kind of like, yeah, well, I know what you mean. But I remember saying to him afterwards, like, that was, when I took that first chief exec role, I was like, oh, now I know what he means. And then it's a level up when it's your business. And it's, it's kind of, I think, especially when you have investors, we've got some investors. It's the first time, we've sort of been through that process. So what's interesting, I think, for me and Nikki, I suppose, perhaps maybe compared to some other founders, is the actual business we're running and the and what we're doing. We've been there and done it and got the t-shirt. We know how to do all of that. But the kind of piece around setting up, starting up, getting investment, that's a whole new sort of world for us. So I think everyone's probably got their different, I
mean, that's quite common. But, people are experts in the problem they're trying to solve, or at least they should be, in my view. And that's their concentration. And actually, those are the kinds of people that investors want to invest in. They don't care that you don't understand what a term sheet is. They'll teach you. That's, you know what I mean? They don't really care. There's a misconception that, especially when it comes to entering into the startup world, that you'll be looked upon unfavorably for not understanding the startup world. But actually, if you're coming into it with a place of, I just really care about solving this problem, you're welcome with open arms, because that's what it's all about. Everything else, they're like, we'll show you. It's a community, and we'll show you. We don't, no one cares about that. You'll figure it out as you go. And that's, I think, one of the beautiful things about the ecosystem as a whole within the startup, the startup ecosystem, not just tech, but even more broadly, service-led, everything, product-led, everything like that, is that it is like that. It is, we want more people to come in. I have this, just to quickly touch on a point you mentioned earlier about your kind of views growing up on entrepreneurialism and stuff like that. Like, I have this thing where I do a lot of mentoring work and stuff with young people, where I say, look, if there's any part of you that's ever wanted to be or is currently an activist, the best way to be an activist, in my view, is to become an entrepreneur. If you're really passionate about disrupting something, don't make a sign in your living room and go out. I mean, look, you can do that if you want, but you're not going to really, let's be honest, you're not really going to do anything. You really want to disrupt something, figure out what the problem is and figure out a solution to that problem. That is how you can be disruptive. That is in my view, the most disruptive form of activism that there is. Go and do something about it.
100%. Be that market disruptor by solve that problem. And I again, it depends on your sort of, not to get too deep on the kind of, are you free marketeer and all the rest of it? Do you believe in capital markets and things like that? But that's the system we have, right? So that's how it works. And be the change you want to see, which again is like really cliche, but it's true in terms of saying, look, if you believe there's a better way, go out and prove it and show it, but do it in a responsible way. I mean, I think that's the big thing
these
for me, I say.
Drive me nuts, because it's like, there's a lot of proof as to why we've decided to go this way. Maybe just read some books about communism and see, you might figure it out pretty quick. Like, the grown-ups in the room have been doing this a while. Like, it's not perfect. Absolutely not. It's not perfect. But, don't say destroy everything. Come on. Like, what the fuck
any form of extreme is
come to us with a grown-up argument.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, okay, pat on the head, off you go. It's like...
Yeah, but I think, like you say, I think what's interesting as well with sort of being in a startup is, and I've always been lucky. I've always enjoyed all the jobs I've done, to be honest, and been able to make change and be successful. But I think what's interesting about being in a startup again is just that, I think I mentioned it, the sort of weight of responsibility, both to the idea, both to each other, but to the sort of shareholders now as well. That responsibility you feel to sort of like, wow, these people, friends, family, people within your network, people that the number of people who've shown us sort of support that we've known for years or just recently, or the kind of, whether that's about actual investment, or whether that's also about support or mentoring and advice. I think you sort of wake up every day thinking, we need to smash today because this is coming up, and there's always, everything's quite big. But I think the prioritization is also really, really important. Again, having come from organizations where it's stuffed full of really bright people and experts at everything. I always used to say at Which, it's like there's an expert for everything. Just open a cupboard and there's one there. You go and ask somebody. It's like we're those experts now. So again, it was for us. We've gone from being executives. I'm sort of doing this. That's not very good. We're up here doing this. Kind of executive level. Overseeing stuff that loads of bright, capable people are doing, to, oh God, we're doing the social media campaign, or we're writing the article, or doing the tweet, or, whatever. So
it's definitely a culture coming from that corporate background into the startup world, for sure.
Yeah, but great. I think one of the things, again, about sort of thinking about the people that you work with is that we were always both willing and able, and also clear that was going to be the case. We wanted to, for as long as we could, sort of bootstrap the business and do everything ourselves. So we fully kind of could set it up in the way that we think is right. But we will look forward to, we're about to do another investment round, and we are really looking forward to hiring some great people to help us, take the business forward. So it's really enjoyable, and time flies. I can't believe it's been two years, and you can see the progress that you're making. But it is much harder to start something than it is to run something that's already successful. That's definitely my experience, having been in kind of large brands where you've been able to kind of put another 10% on, or grow it by this, or change it in that way, or even launching something within an existing business. It's much easier than when you don't have a brand, you blah blah blah. I mean, again, just small things like that, where it's kind of like sending out your press release. If it's coming from a brand like Which, it's welcomed with open arms and everybody's ready to read it. When you're a brand that nobody knows, it's an extra level of, it doesn't matter how great the story is, you've got to work 10 times harder with the relationships with journalists or others to be seen, to be noticed. So you really do need to have a really strong story and a really strong product. Otherwise you don't make it, basically. So I kind of like that, though, because I think it's, you are really testing out.
Well, it forces you to think outside the box and to be creative and resourceful and so on. But it's an incredibly important message, though, I think, for anyone listening and watching to my show who's like not a founder yet, or haven't, a business owner yet, but thinking about it. Is what I tell to when I do my mentorship work all the time to similar people, is that they just don't know where to start. That often that's the problem that they're confronted with. They have the idea, they don't even know where to start. And my question is just, well, where do you think you should start? Maybe do this, so then do that. You just got to start. It's such a cop-out answer, but it's true. It's just like, I have all these goals to do in the gym and do this. It's okay, we'll just go there one day. But the point is, you have to just go there. Be in the building. Don't necessarily have to lift up the weight that day, but just go in the building. That's step number one. It doesn't have to be, because that's the problem with the kind of conversations that we have and put out into the world, I guess. We talk about such huge issues, complex scenarios. It can be quite daunting and scary for someone who's not in it. I think the important distilled message is just go out and start. It's fine. Don't worry about all that nonsense. What do we know?
Well, it's true. And I think, but also it's like, make sure, that the thing that you're going to go out and start, you do feel so passionately about, because on the dark days, like, you shouldn't really, you don't have Sunday scaries as much when it's your own business, because it's almost you're like, right, what am I gonna, well, one, you've probably been working anyway, but two, what am I gonna be, so you're hungry to kind of get going, and that, not every week's like that, but it's also more to play like that.
Devil's advocate, which I'm pretty good at doing, as you can probably tell by now. On the flip side of that is don't be afraid to fail, and don't be afraid that if it's okay to just start something to start it. It doesn't matter if you're not 100% in it. You will figure that out, and you can always change later. It's not the end of the world. Like, I think it's quite easy to say from our privileged positions as someone who's found purpose in what we're doing, at least for now, right? That's like, but then equally, it's like, I speak to people, for example, who are like, I'm thinking of starting a construction business, or, I want to be a carpenter. And so it's okay. Like, is that what you're passionate about? No, but it's like, it's a good solid business. I'm like, okay, then fine, do it. And it's like, you can figure some other stuff out later. Do you know what I mean? Like, broadly speaking, it's like sometimes it's just like, just do it. See how it goes. You'll learn so much. There's no net loss that can occur from chasing something that actually fails. There isn't actually any way you can lose in that scenario, other than maybe your ego might be slightly hurt. But everything you will experience along the way is going to be valuable. But if you can sit down and do what you said, great. That's better, obviously. But
I suppose that's probably also the difference between, like you say, where you're breaking ground or where you're kind of joining something that exists. Like if it's less of it, like where's the risk in what you're doing? Is it personal risk? To do a whole new thing with a whole new idea and all of that. And then I think that does have to have like a kind of furnace within you. But I think if you're kind of looking at something saying, look, the risk is more like that I'm not like, I fully love this, but actually it's a solid business that is, that with a market that everybody understands. So I think, because if you get those things out of alignment, risks, like if it's too, I think you do kind of have to go into a startup also working out that you've got you've got to work out what your own risk appetite is really, and what you can like personally afford to put on the line, both financially, emotionally, and all of the rest of it. You need to kind of be in the right sort of place. Now, I'm probably not typical in that I kind of went on maternity leave and decided that I wanted to found my own business, but I think part of that gave me the shove because I'd been out of like sort of full-time work and had the ability to sort of go, right, well, I've kind of survived, with little to no pay for this year. We're in an arrangement where I can think about, and actually I knew I wanted to go back to work, but I also wanted to work on something that really mattered to me. And so actually, again, I think all of those life circumstances sort of like help you to kind of go, now's the time. I think I just felt like I'd got this moment
to do some of
say,
that self-reflection we were talking about, right? So
if I, now also is the time for me. Whereas a few years earlier, when I'd considered it prior to being in between jobs, it wasn't the right time for that idea. But I also don't think it was personally quite the right time for me yet either. Like I wasn't ready to sort of jump off out of this kind of 11-year relationship that I'd been in at Which, where it was kind of like, this is my everything. I needed something else before I then decided to do my own thing. So I think that's
it's
also
like that cliched line from like movies, when the hero is told by some sort of some mysterious riddle speaking kind of quest giver, like, you'll know when you're ready. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, how will I know? Well, I'm ready. You'll know when you're ready. It's that kind of thing,
Yeah. And also, like you say, kind of not ready. Like there are some days you wake up and go like, oh my God, was this a good idea? Like this is, that was all the time. Child, and I'm trying to do all these things, but
what am I doing?
I think, but I think it's also like a brilliant, it's a brilliant thing to do, and it's, when it's, there are so many things to learn. Like you say, you're not going to get everything right, but I think it's, it's sort of like working out, and course correcting as quick as possible. And I enjoy all of that. So, for me, I love changing things. I love doing new things. So I wouldn't be one for a kind of sort of mundane day to day anyway. So maybe I was always sort of in this world and just didn't really realize it.
I've said on this show time and time again as well. At this point, I'm just unemployable anyway. So I've been an entrepreneur now for such a long time that no one was going to hire me. So I've got no choice, really. I've painted myself into a corner. But look, I've got to let you go because we've gone over, and I don't want to keep you because I know you've got so much to do. And but I really appreciate you taking the time to show me. It's been awesome. It's been a really interesting conversation.
It's been brilliant.
And could easily keep going. Ton of stuff I'd want to ask you about and chat about, but I will let you go. So thanks so much. I'll be putting your LinkedIn and of course, the website and everything in the description of the episode. So anyone who wants to check out a bit about Alex, a bit about Consumer Voice, etc., just go in there, check that out. Is there anything else we should be popping in there? Anyone you want to shout out? Anything at all?
No, I would say just my co-founder Nikki Stopford, but she's also on our website too. So all that information is there. So really Brilliant. Just coming to visit our website and hopefully joining our community, because we'd love to see you there.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you again. And it's been lovely chatting with you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, week, etc. And good luck with the round and everything like that. And hopefully we'll be catching up again very soon.
Great stuff. Thanks, Greg.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for listening and or watching. Please like and subscribe. Or if you are listening via podcasting service and want to show your support, consider rating or leaving a review. It really helps. See you next week.